All right, let's jump right in. Let's discuss the New York Times Code of Ethics. First, we need to know the basics of the code. The New York Times Code reflects the ongoing tension between economic realities and social responsibility. This means the code is less about traditional journalistic ethics and more about balancing economic need with the need to serve the public. The code was created for all members of the news and editorial departments of the Times. Oddly, it only mentions privacy once and accuracy and fairness never. The focus is all on the conflict of interest. Now, what exactly is conflict of interest? It's a situation in which concerns or aims of two different parties are incompatible. For the Times, these parties could be the public and the investors, advertisers and content creation, other competing news stations and the newspaper, and even social media and the news outlet. The code focuses in on many possible conflicts of interest. It recognizes marriage as a potential conflict of interest. It draws lines about reporting abroad and whether or not to follow the mandates of that country and the mores of that country. It mandates that journalists disclose yearly speaking fees of more than $5,000, stop accepting gifts, tickets, discounts, etc. from organizations, cease investing in companies covered in articles, never accept payments to run articles, so on and so forth. It also prohibits funding candidates, marching in parades, and speaking on other talk shows. They can, however, do unpaid work in a few cases. This might look like a lot of restrictions, but it might not be. Now, let's look at the first code of ethics designed by journalists. In 1933, the American Newspaper Guild pioneered the way. The code asked for editing strictly in the newsroom, less business pressure, and many other idealistic traditions, such as presuming persons accused of a crime of being innocent until they are convicted. Well, that didn't really happen. Within the same year of the Ethics Code, the reporting of the Lindbergh case was so biased, even the tabloids were shocked. Many believe ethic codes are mere aspirations and more about the power and politics of a time rather than a true code to adhere to. So although the New York Times Code looks very intensive, it might not be. To explore this issue further, let's discuss micro, mid-range, and macro issues. Managers should follow a code of ethics as well, especially with a newspaper as influential as the Times. They have a duty to the stakeholders of the public sphere, the audience, and all media competitors. The managers and owners cannot merely adhere to the shareholders. They must take the effects and impacts on the environment into consideration when making the decisions. Now, you will notice the case does not stop the action of conflicting interest. It appears to focus on destroying any possible perception of conflicting interest. The Times realized the reputation, which is all perception, needs to be good in order to be trusted. It is extremely difficult to disprove conflict of interest, so this seems like the way to go. I believe this is why the Times did not focus on accuracy and fairness. They wanted to gain the trust of the public back with the mere perception truth. Problem is, few seem to trust the newspapers, let alone the New York Times. Conflict of interest is clearly affecting many media outlets. When the media is owned by private companies, the loyalty sector of the Potter box becomes pretty complex. New York Times has a credibility rating of 49 according to Pew Research. That is the same as USA Today. To increase the credibility, they need to increase the accuracy of the news, not just remove the perception of conflict of interest. In 2007, more than 59% of all newspaper articles were inaccurate. Merely focusing on conflict of interest will not save. When conflict of interest does arise, disclosure may not be the best remedy. Disclosure is often ineffective. People latch on to the disclosure due to anchoring bias or the other way around. Disclosure may be cheap and transparency is necessary, but disclosure does not solve the issue of conflict of interest. Most ethical principles behind conflict of interest codes need to be adhered to no matter where you work. Some of the Times codes would not be plausible for a small paper. Smaller papers often have relationships with local organizations and will run press releases for those organizations. Also, the journalists at small newspapers might need to make money outside of that newspaper if the pay is not as high as it is at the New York Times. They should be allowed to be paid for the other work. While all of these codes might seem rather intensive, the Times is not infringing on the First Amendment. The First Amendment reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances." The First Amendment clearly applies to the government, not private business. The staffers have the freedom of speech, but now they are aware of the consequences of a certain speech on their work. If someone has a conflict of interest with an assignment, a journalist can just pass that important assignment onto someone without the conflict of interest. This will avoid almost all conflict and any perception of conflict of interest. The journalists need to act ethically, no matter how unsatisfying removing yourself from the story is. However, I do not see a problem with journalists being involved within the community. The editor can decide whether to run a story. Just because it is written doesn't mean it is run. If the organization leans one way politically or openly supports a candidate, then the journalist needs to use best judgment and leave the organization. If the organization is deciding on school policies of the local elementary, another journalist can just cover the story. Journalists can be involved in the community without raising ethical questions. The Times created this code because journalism is transforming into other media. Newspapers are decreasing in popularity while TV and online reporting are increasing. With the rise of social media and blogging, the New York Times must fight to stay relevant long term. This would be difficult with their journalists losing credibility because of conflict of interest or inaccuracy, or even working for other news outlets. Because if they start losing their journalist to the social media or blog sphere, then the paper would have to stop. Sadly, this code appears to be just another ideological marker of the time. If the codes were created by the staff and approved by the management, it would mean more. Without any real consequences, the code is merely a concept, not a law of the workplace. Jason Blair would not have been discovered in a timely manner because of the code, because the code barely, if at all, mentions his main transgressions. Instead, the code focuses almost entirely over the aspiration of regaining the public trust is to make money. In conclusion, the Times Code, although idealistic, creates a wonderful ethical code for conflict of interest for a major news source. However, with no real backbone to the code, it is just a document bringing attention to the specific relationships. In fact, it may even obscure ethical bounds. If something isn't listed or doesn't fit perfectly within the parameters of this code, then do ethics apply? Some people will probably think no, and will refer to the code if questioned. The Times Code might help beginner journalists, PR professionals, and photographers, but it might also harm the industry.